All right, good morning. On Thursday, you've got both homework 11 due, and we're also having our second midterm exam. So I'm glad you're here today. We're going to be reviewing some important things in class. For the exam, it's going to be similar to the format of the first test, where there were some concept questions that had to be solved without the use of any sort of equation sheet or notes. Those are short answer questions. And then in the second part of the exam is problem solving, where you're going to need access to a computer. So bring a computer that has Microsoft Excel, that is able to connect to the network so that you can upload your file at the end of the exam. When you work on Excel problems, you'll have to start with a blank worksheet. You won't be able to use any previously prepared in-class exercise or homework file. You will be allowed to use a page of notes. And so as you prepare for the exam, one of my suggestions is to work through any of the in-class exercises that we've done since the first test where you're using Excel. So just refamiliarize yourself with the solution strategy for each one of those problem types, and maybe taking notes on an outline on what you do, like what step, or the column titles can be useful as an outline for the solution strategy. Any questions about the exam? Now, I have received a couple of questions on the project, and so that's an indicator to me that people are starting to spend a little bit more time working on that. But I'll point it out again because, after the test, you won't have any homework assignments for a little while until the new material gets introduced. So there will be a gap in what you need to be doing for the homework, and I'd suggest that you really start working hard on the project because there's just a couple of weeks left for that. Today we're going to be doing replacement studies, and we're going to practice once again for a second time how to do an economic service life analysis. So before we get into the replacement studies, any questions before we move on? All right. Well, in engineering and in business, you're often faced with the situation where old equipment needs to be replaced. And we discussed in the previous lecture the three broad reasons why equipment is replaced over time, related to its obsolescence, related to a loss of functionality or a reduction in safety, and changing requirements. So what this image illustrates is on the left, the control room for a chemical plant back in the old days where dials were analog and where a person had to be continually monitoring the status of a production process. And on the right, an automated strategy where you can see it's a computerized system that probably doesn't need an operator. There are chairs for a human operator to kind of just passively monitor what's going on. But this new equipment was probably a lot more expensive than the existing equipment. And what we're going to do today is look at how do you know when to make that transition? How do you know when to replace the old thing and buy the new thing? So in the previous class, what we did was we identified how long is the correct number of years to own a thing before replacing it. And today we're going to compound that idea by comparing two items together, doing replacement studies and economic service life analysis for both of them. So your objective in a study like this is to minimize the costs that a business incurs. And both of them are going to be expenses. And what you're going to do is focus on comparing the differences. If two alternatives have something the same, then you ignore that similar thing in the analysis. Like if they're going to generate the same amount of revenue, it's the differences that are going to be driving the decision, not the similarities. So what you need to do in the process is, first of all, assuming that both the defender and the challenger meet the required specifications, that both of them are equally effective at whatever the need is. The defender, remember, is the name that we give to the existing equipment. The challenger is the name that we give to the alternative it's the best among the new possibilities for replacement. There are two situations. Sometimes the problem scenario will already describe how long the equipment needs to last. That's the study period is specified. There will be other situations where no study period is specified, and you just have to look at the lifespan of the equipment and its costs to identify not only which one's better, but then also how long it should be owned. So when the study period is specified, you're assuming that there's some way to make the two alternatives last the same amount of time. Remember, we can't compare two options, one that's short and one that's long. Does anybody remember what some of our strategies have been in the past to make cash flow diagrams end at the same year? Okay, very good. Yeah, so the least common multiple approach was one of those where we cycled alternatives until they ended at the same year. What were some of the other ways of doing that same thing, making them terminate in the same year? Good. Early termination, which is assuming whatever was going to last longer, we sell on the open market and receive a salvage value. And then the last alternative? Contract services. Good. And so contract services, assuming that for the item that's shorter, you just go out and lease for a certain number of years until the time frame is the same as the option that would last longer. So what we're saying here is if you're comparing two alternatives and you have a fixed study period that you have to provide this service or equipment to your company for that number of years, we're assuming that when the shorter one ends, there's some way to go out and find a replacement for the remaining years. Sometimes, though, no study period is specified, and we're just left to look at the natural lifespan and costs of the items in question to determine how long to own it. And in a case like that, you perform the economic service life analysis for both of them, and then you would choose the alternative with the lowest total annual worth of costs. And so this is your decision criteria. And that's a phrase that I've repeated several times this semester, is you have to know for every analysis technique, what's the decision criteria. So for instance, in present worth analysis, you'd pick the alternative that has the highest present worth. For external rate of return analysis, you'd choose the alternative that has the highest external rate of return. For benefit cost analysis, the decision criteria is the alternative is acceptable if the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. In incremental benefit cost analysis, the criteria is if the incremental benefit cost analysis is greater than 1, then you'd choose the more expensive alternative. So you have to know the if-then for every one of these techniques. Otherwise, you can't apply it correctly. And the answer on your paper, even if you've done all the math correctly, if you can't say which alternative is better and why, then you haven't really solved the problem. So here, for a replacement study, if you have no study period specified, the criteria for knowing which one is better is the one that has the lowest total annual worth of costs. And we went through that spreadsheet technique of how you annualize the costs in last class, and we're going to refresh that for practice today. Now, in the real world, you're going to have to revisit this kind of an analysis on an annual basis to make sure that your projections of costs and your projections of value are holding up and that they were accurate. You know, we're going to do this analysis today, and we're looking 6 years into the future, and we're trying to predict for a piece of equipment what's its market value 6 years from now. And we'll do our best in year 0, which is now, to predict that, but the circumstances may change. A piece of equipment may suddenly become more valuable than anticipated because it has rare materials in it, or maybe there's been a shortage of components, or it may become less valuable as new items have come onto the market. So you may have to reiterate a study, refresh a study with new numbers fairly often. Okay, so part 1 of your in-class exercise today is a replacement study where we are comparing two alternatives, a defender and a challenger. And I have on the handout here a template that you should use to set up your Excel file. We're going to solve this one on Excel. Okay, so this one is study period is not specified. So we don't have to make these two alternatives the same number of years. What we're doing in this analysis is we're just going to do economic service life for the two alternatives, and then we're going to pick the one that has the lowest total annual worth of costs. So we've got two options, and we just want to minimize our costs for however long that minimization occurs. So you can see the columns are labeled A through G. Some of the data is given, A, B, and C. That's given in the problem statement. And then I've given you some hints on how to calculate columns D, E, F, and G. Here are the formulas or what you need to do, for each one of those. So essentially what we're doing right now is just practicing the same thing as we did in class on Thursday. We're practicing economic service life analysis. And so start up Excel, create a spreadsheet for both the Defender and the Challenger. The interest rate's the same for both of them. The first cost is going to be different, and you're going to find out the total annual worth of costs for each year that those two pieces of equipment are going to last, and then pick the one that's lowest. The formula for column G should say E plus F, not E plus I. That's a typo. So it's the two costs together, capital recovery and operating costs. Okay, let me reiterate some of the important things that you have to be aware of for this analysis. Now, first of all, it said in the problem statement that the first cost, well, it said the current value for the defender is $15,000. And we talked about this last week, that when you're keeping an item, that means you're losing the opportunity to sell it. So the first cost for equipment that you already own is its current market value. And so that's why in the problem statement it said the existing equipment has a current market value of $15,000. So we put a minus sign in front of that, because if we keep it, that means we can't sell it. So that's what we assume our first cost is for existing equipment. Now the next thing is, it said the market value declines by 20% each year for 3 years. So the way I set that up is that Now, as a market value, if we do sell it, it's positive instead of negative. So if we do sell it, these market values should be positive amounts. And to go from 15,000 to 12,000, that's a 20% reduction. Or in other words, you're keeping 80% of the value. So I just multiplied the previous amount by 0.8. So you'll notice this market value saying 0.8 times the first cost, and I put a negative sign in just to flip it. But then for these subsequent years, it's just 80% of the market value above it without the negative sign, because I want to keep it as a positive value. Okay, the operating costs were defined directly. Now the PV of the cumulative operating costs to date, that is where I'm using the NPV function, and each year it's just the cumulative amount, so it's all of the operating costs up until that row and including that row. All right, and then to annualize those, we have to do the payment function, where this PV is what we put in as the present value, the cumulative operating costs that have been taken to the present. And you'll notice that I put a negative sign in front of that PV, and the reason why is the payment function automatically flips the sign. And these are costs, and they're still going to be costs, and so I don't want it to change it from negative to positive. I want it to stay as negative, so I have to manually reverse that change of sign. Capital recovery. Just to refresh your memory what capital recovery is, if you buy an item and then you eventually sell the item, capital recovery is how much that is on an equivalent annual basis. And so capital recovery is, let's find out the annual equivalent amount. CR is the difference between the first cost and the salvage value, or the market value. So in this capital recovery function, what we do is we combine both the first cost and the market value in the same function. So the first cost is a present value. The market value is a future value. So here in capital recovery, you'll notice, first of all, I've got my interest rate specified, and I'm anchoring that with the dollar signs. And then for N, it's just whatever year we're on. The present value is the reference to the first cost, and that's already a negative, which it should be since it's a cost. The market value is what I'm using as my future value, and it's positive since it's a revenue. But then in the function, I've got this negative sign outside the payment, because if I didn't, it would turn these capital recoveries positive. And we know that it's not positive. We have a bigger first cost, which is negative, than any of the market values. So we're going to be losing money on an annual basis for the capital recovery. So we want to combine those two costs together. We want to combine the operating costs and the ownership costs that are associated with the purchase price versus the sales price. So the total costs then are going to be the combination of those two things, operating and capital recovery costs. And what we can see by doing the same thing again on the Challenger was that the lowest costs are associated with the Defender being owned for 3 years. And so here in bold where it says determine what the company should do, our answer is that the company should keep the Defender for 3 years. And the reason why is that's going to minimize the costs. So our criteria for this analysis was minimize the total annual worth of costs. And that's associated with 3 years of the Defender. After 3 years, then we'll just look at what are all our alternatives then. Set out a request for bids and choose whatever options are best. But at this point, it looks like our best alternative is to keep the existing equipment for 3 years. Any questions on this in-class exercise before we move on? Now remember, the video's here, and you wouldn't go to a basketball game if you've only shot the ball twice. And you've only done this 2 times so far. You did it today in class. You did it in class on Thursday. We're going to do it one more today, but the point is you should give yourself the opportunity to practice this. And so you've been through it once. Save your file, and then create another tab and solve it again tonight. And if you solve it maybe 2 more times tonight, you're going to be able to do it in your sleep. It'll be really easy, second nature stuff for you if you practice these. You shouldn't expect for it to make perfect sense the first or second time you go through it, but after a few more times, especially if you can read the problem statement and connect all the dots yourself without seeing it up on the screen, if you do it independently and it's fine, then you'll definitely be ready for the exam. That's my suggestion. Okay, so we just did when no study period is specified, which means we just go with however many years is cheapest. Sometimes the study period is specified, and that will be the case on our second in-class exercise. And what you need to do there is prepare a cash flow diagram for both alternatives, for both the defender and the challenger. And usually what we'll use as the study period is however long the new piece of equipment lasts, because presumably the defender, the existing equipment, isn't going to last as long as the challenger. Usually the defender is old equipment that you're thinking of replacing or maybe keeping for a couple more years, but the challenger will last longer. So what you'll need to do then is find some way to extend the life of the defender. So you have to identify some method to account for that. And the two alternatives that we'll have available, we won't use LCM for these types of replacement studies. What we'll use is purchase the challenger after the defender is retired. So you'll basically either buy the new equipment now or buy it later, or you'll use contract services to extend the life of the defender. Okay, so before we actually jump into Excel, let me walk you through this analysis that you've got on the back side of the page. I've already done the cash flow diagram for you. This said the first step is to prepare a cash flow diagram. Just for sake of time, because we've only got about 25 minutes left for class, I did the cash flow diagram. So here is our defender. Our existing equipment in the exercise we're going to do, it has a current market value of $70,000. If we sold this defender today, we could get $70,000 for it, which means if we keep it, it's effectively costing us $70,000. So the defender option is we spend $70,000 now because we're not selling it, and then it has annual operating costs. That's what AOC stands for, annual operating costs of $30,000 a year for 3 years. Then the equipment has no value, has no salvage value. What we'll have to do after the 3 years is then purchase a replacement. Now the Challenger, this new equipment that we're considering, costs $750,000 now, annual operating costs of $50,000, and then it lasts for 10 years. So 10 years is our study period. It's the life of the Challenger. So we have to find some way to use the defender and then also bridge the gap all the way out to 10 years. And what we're going to do to make those two lives the same, we're going to, in the problem statement, it says that you can then purchase some new item that has a capital recovery cost of $146,475. It's essentially a piece of equipment that had a $900,000 initial purchase price, and what we were able to do is find out what's the annual equivalent of that initial purchase price. So that's already given to us. But here's the tricky thing, is this new equipment lasts for 10 years. And so what we're going to do is we're going to transfer that new equipment to some other owner for the remaining 3 years of its life. A lot of companies have many divisions, and so what we're assuming is that our division of the company will hold the equipment for 7 years, and then that equipment will be transferred to another division of the company that will then assume those capital recovery costs for the remaining 3 years. And you'll also notice that the annual operating costs go up once we take ownership of that new equipment. So we'll have combined annual costs of $50,000 for the operating and $146,475 for the capital recovery. So we need to find out which one is cheaper on the basis of annual worth, because not only the question isn't which is better, the question is also how long to keep it. Because if all we wanted to do is find out which one is better, we could take everything to the present. And then that would tell us defender is better or challenger is better. But we need more information than just which is better. We need to know which is better and how long to keep it. So we're going to go through the same process as we did on the first in-class exercise. You're going to need to set up a spreadsheet that has the amounts, and we're going to need to find the net present value of those amounts and then take the annual worth of each. So let me show you what you can set up to solve this one. The column titles, we're going to have, first of all, an interest rate that's going to be specified, and then we're going to have years. There's going to be the defender, the challenger, and then we're going to go through 10 years of analysis. You'll need to calculate the NPVs and then find the annual worth equivalent of that. And so the nice thing about this example is that we already know all of the annual costs, whereas you had to kind of calculate them in the previous example. Here in this one, you already know the operating costs, you already know the capital recovery costs. So what we can do is take everything to the present and then find the annual worth. This procedure is a lot easier than what we were looking at for the first part of the in-class exercise. If we toggle back to that first sheet, you know, we had lots of different rows, lots of different columns, and so the difference between the two is the study period was not specified, so compared to here, we know it's going to be 10 years. You know, that's a given, 10 years of analysis, and so we don't have to find out what's the annual worth if you keep it 1 year, what's the annual worth if you keep it 2 years, and so on and so forth. The only thing we're doing is we're finding the 10-year annual worth for the defender and the 10-year annual worth for the challenger, because the study period was specified on the second problem. Whereas, just to reiterate, on the first problem, we had to find out the annual worth for any number of years of possible ownership to find out which one was the lowest. So really, study period specified makes these analyses considerably easier. But I still think this was good practice because it refreshed our memory on how to use the NPV function. If we just take a quick look here, amounts inside the NPV function should only be money that's not already at the present. Just based on the way the function's set up, the first number that it sees inside of this range, it's expecting that to be money in year 1. So the year 0 amount needs to be added on outside of that function. So you'll notice up here I'm saying it's B5 through B14 because those were all of the amounts in the future. But then the B4, which was the year 0 amount, is added external to the NPV function. And then when we annualize this present value, we're using the payment function, and I threw in that minus sign just so that we would keep the negative sign that we had in the present values along with the annual amounts. And so in this case, the defender is the better alternative because it has the lower annual worth over the 10-year study period. Any questions about this comparison? If not, we're going to finish for now. Let me just, one other thing, remind you, of course, we've got our exam coming up on Thursday. You should prepare a page of notes you can write on the back and on the front side of that. I'm also going to bring the factors that you'd need for any problems. I'm glad that you're all here today. I know lots of your classmates aren't. It's hard to get to these 8 o'clock classes. So I'll really appreciate it if you can come to class on time. That enables everybody to hear the announcements and for us to make the most of our time together. So thanks very much for being here. I'll see you for the exam on Thursday. And if you have any questions as you're working on the assignment or as you're studying, please feel free to send me an email or stop by my office hours. I'd be more than happy to help you out. See you Thursday.